Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as it may be. This brief video is an introduction to identifiers in HL7 FHIR, and my name is Terry Sippel-Schmidt. Identifiers in FHIR are fairly complex and they can be very confusing. And so we're going to take some time right now to try to demystify identifiers a bit and explain the two primary methods of identification that are used in HL7 FHIR. The first is an object identifier, also called an ID, is primarily used by computers. The second is a business identifier, known as an identifier, and is primarily used by people. First, we're going to talk about object identifiers. So if you are a computer, you're going to take a look at this ID, and the way that this is always going to be written is the name of the resource or the type of the resource and the ID itself. So perhaps this will say patient slash and then a 64-character string. Perhaps it'll say organization slash and a 64-character string. These are known as object locators or logical IDs. As I mentioned, they're 64-character alphanumeric strings assigned by a computer. Each FHIR server has a unique locator, which can be used on the URL path via an API. So let's take a look at that. Here we have a call, an API call, HTTPS, with the endpoint definition. So for example, informatics.azurefhirehealthcareapis.com. The resource name, in this particular case, it's a patient, and then this lovely 64-character alphanumeric string. This is not something that you want to type in once, much less over and over. So if you're going to use this as a programmer, first you're going to query for that ID, you're going to write that to a variable, and then you're going to use it. Object identifiers, you're going to hear it referred to as an OID, sometimes as a UID or unique identifier, or a GID, a global identifier. An OID is unique to the particular FHIR server that you are working on. So it is really the URL or the endpoint plus the OID, which identifies that particular resource. You can think of an ID as a primary database key if you took the SQL class. However, when you go to look in the FHIR standard definition itself, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to find where the ID is defined. The ID is defined as part of the metadata for every resource type. So it is not part of the resource itself, it's part of the metadata for every resource. To find the definition of this resource metadata, it's a little tricky. So here's the main page of all resource types. This is the index with the 5 layers of every resource type that exists in FHIR. But you will not find one called resource. Rather, it's tucked away up here. So it talks about the abstract base layers of resources. This is, if you click on this link right here, which says resource, you're going to get this, this menu, this structure. You'll notice that here's the resource name, resource, and here are the different types of metadata which can be inside the resource. The first is the ID. This is the most critical by far. The metadata we'll talk about in a bit. Implicit rules include things like whether or not an item can be deleted in security, and then language, the primary language. But the one that we're interested in today is this ID right there. The catch is that there are two types of identifiers, two types of IDs, or object identifiers. The first is a server-assigned ID, and this is the ugly 64-digit character, which is unique on that computer, on that server. The second is a client-assigned ID, and the reason for this is because it's very difficult for people who are programming to remember these 64-character digits, and so we're going to write it to a variable name. The variable name has to be posted to the FHIR server, however. So the way that this is done is that when you're doing a create, which is a post in HTTPS, so here we have this is this postman. So here we have a post. Here we have the endpoint, which is informatics.azurhealthcareapis.com, followed by the resource name. It's an organization. So down here we have the JSON for the body of the post that we're going to send to the FHIR server. And the resource always has to match. So here we have resource type organization. Up here on the URL, we have that it's an organization. Here we're going to give it a client assigned ID, and we're going to say that the ID for this organization is Johns Hopkins JHFHIR. In this way, we'll be able to refer to JHFHIR going forward, and the server will remember that this JHFHIR is now mapped to the 64-digit character string. There's some excellent documentation on this available at this link for Smile, the Smile Happy server. And this is about one of the better descriptions of resource IDs if you're interested in more implementation. The only other thing that I really wanted to note was that, especially for these client assigned IDs, that those can be FHIR server implementation dependent. So be really careful before you start using them. All right, at this point, we're going to jump over for a brief demonstration in Postman. So now I am on my Johns Hopkins Safe Desktop, and this is my Postman application. If you're not familiar with Postman, there's another video available for that. I have created several different scripts, and I've created a create patient script. So up here I have a post, which is a create, and here I have my URL, informatics-azure-healthcare-apis.com. And here I have my resource name, and I'm going to create a patient. So down here, my resource type matches my URL, which is patient. I have active as true, and I have some other information such as name and other information below. I'm going to go ahead and send that to the FHIR server. Here's my response down here in this window. You'll notice that I have a 201 created response, which means successful creation. But if I look at the JSON response from the FHIR server, I have my resource type, which is patient. And now down here, I have an ID, which is a 64-character alphanumeric string. And I'm going to go ahead and copy that ID. I also have some metadata. Part of my metadata says that this is the first version ID. So this is the first version that I'm creating of this patient, that it was last updated on March 19th of 2001, which is today, a few minutes ago. Then after that, you can see all the other JSON which I supplied to the server, active as true and name and all of those things. I'm going to go back up here to another script called list patients or query for patients. And I'm going to add my ID to the URL. So here on my URL, I now have get, which is query. Here's my same endpoint, informatics-azure-healthcare-apis.com. I'm still looking at patient resources because it has to be the same resource type. And here's my ID for the new patient I just created. And I'm going to go ahead and hit send. Now, I have a 200 back, status back, which is success. So I created the patient, and then using that ID, I was able to query for that same patient and get the information back. In other words, the round trip worked, which is great. So we'll go back to our demonstration, to our presentation. All right, we're going to switch gears. Business identifiers. So if you're a human, an identifier can be found in multiple different resources. These include a patient, practitioner, organization, and other resources. For this video, we are going to focus on a patient identifier. The purpose of a patient identifier is to gather healthcare record information from across all the different departments and to be able to put it into a single folder or virtual jacket within the electronic healthcare record system. It's also very important for billing because that's what connects to the insurance information. You may hear this referred to as a patient identifier or PID, or you may hear it referred to as a medical record number. To the best of my knowledge, they're the same thing. In FHIR, a patient ID has a type. The type can have many different business identifiers associated with it. It can be a social security number, a driver's license, and furthermore, a patient may have multiple patient identifiers assigned by different healthcare institutions. FHIR also has a use, which is also similar to a status. It can be an official identifier. It can be temporary if the patient came in through emergency room, for example. It could be secondary or old if the patient records were changed and the patient was assigned a new patient identifier, or for example, if two patient records were merged to be a single patient. To make things a little more complex, especially in the United States, there are a lot of healthcare acquisitions where one hospital system is purchasing another hospital system. If there are shared patients between those hospital systems, they now have two different patient identifiers or multiple patient identifiers. In HL7 version 2, which is a predecessor standard to FHIR, the way that that was solved is that a patient identifier was always the patient identifier plus the assigning authority. So it was some number plus, for example, St. Joe's Hospital. FHIR decided to take a slightly different tact on that, and we made it to have a namespace. A namespace is a computer processable number. Starts with, in this case, a universal resource name, and it's an OID, and it's a number which a computer will recognize. It's not something that a human's going to look at. It has a value. So for example, 365-09-3954. So in FHIR, the most important thing to get a unique patient identifier is this namespace and this value. Now, assigning authority is still in FHIR because that's what's needed for a human being. So for example, the assigning authority may still be St. Joe's, but when it comes to actually using the data to identify a unique patient ID, in FHIR, it's namespace plus the value. In HL7 version 2 was assigning authority plus the value. So slight difference, but important clarification. All right, we're going to go take a brief tour of the HL7 FHIR patient resource. So if you go to HL7 FHIR resources and you click on the patient resource, you'll get to this page. You will notice that the first item, the first element under the patient resource is an identifier. So we're going to go take a look at the identifier data type. So first we click on identifier, and then for some reason you have to wait a minute until it scrolls. Under identifier, you can notice that we have use, and its enumerated terms are usual, official, temporary, secondary, and old, and there's definitions for those. We have type, and we can go take a peek at those enumerated values very briefly. And here we have driver's license, passport number, breed is apparently for veterinary, medical record number. This is the one that we use for patient ID or for the medical record number. This is the one that you will see used the most. Microchip number, hopefully that's not for humans. Down here we have provider numbers for physicians or medical license numbers, donor registration numbers. So you can see that there's quite a few different types of identification. Down here for Canada, there's a jurisdictional health number. I'm going to go back. And so we're back to the identifier data type. Here's system. So here's the universal resource locator or the system name, the namespace that we'll use along with the value. So these are the two key components right here, system and value. And that's what uniquely identifies a patient ID. It also has period, and period is the time period when this was valid. So for example, if hospital system A acquires hospital system B, and hospital system B's patient identifiers are no longer going to be used, they'll put an end date on this period. They won't delete it, but they will put an end date on it to know that it's no longer valid. And then finally, we have a signer. You notice that a signer is an organization. So that's St. Joe's Hospital. And back to our presentation. So how does this work? How can this possibly work so that we can have these globally unique identifiers? Similar to IP addresses. So an IP address is defined by the Internet Assigned Number Authority. In addition to that, there are other registries for unique IDs. These include ANSI and ISO. ISO 9834-1 is a registry of many of the UID roots. So let's talk about, as an example, DICOM. DICOM is an imaging standard. If you ever see a UID, which begins with 1.2.840.10,008, you know that that's a DICOM defined unique identifier. But For any product which is going to create UIDs for objects, they have to get their own UID root. For example, 1.2.840.113619.5 is GE Healthcare MR. And so any unique ID that you see that starts with this root, you know is going to belong to a GE MR imaging system. After this root, there's going to be different components which are added by the MR scanner. And they might include CPU ID, they might include a date and time stamp down to the millisecond. There's all sorts of ways, and then perhaps a random number generator. There's all sorts of ways of making sure that you put together a pattern so that you will never have the same type of identifier across any system globally. Now, one last thing I wanted to mention is that HL7 has an OID registry. So similar to the way that DICOM registers things which I can identify a CT image versus an MR image versus an X-ray image, HL7 also has an OID registry to identify all the different OIDs which are generated. And one more topic, national patient identifiers. Some countries have a national patient identifier, although they're used for different purposes. There's quite a few, actually. Sweden, Denmark, Ireland, Norway, Costa Rica, some of the provinces of Canada have different types of identifiers across healthcare systems. They're used for different reasons. Some are quality monitoring, benchmarking. Some are for pulling prior records and studies so that no matter which hospital system you went to, your studies are always available at the point of care where you are being seen. They're also used for billing. Some of these national patient identifiers are opt-in and some are automatically assigned. So at this point, I'm going to stop and make a plug that if you are ever in a position to be able to propose a national patient identifier for the United States, and if it's opt-in, nonetheless, we would really appreciate it. It's really hard to pull all these different records across all these different healthcare systems owned by different institutions today. All right, a quick recap on identifiers in FHIR. There are two primary methods of identification in FHIR. One is for a computer. It's called an object identifier or an ID. You use that at the end of a URL, and that's how you can uniquely locate a resource within a FHIR server. If it's assigned by the server, it's 64 digits long. For a client, you can assign a variable name to that 64 digits so that it's easier to remember the different object identifiers. The second type of identifier is the business identifier, and that's what people are going to use. The most common one is the patient ID or medical record number, but remember that that patient ID is only unique within a namespace or possibly an organization. On that note, I would like to pause and say, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. We know that identifiers are fairly complex, but it's a really important concept. And so we really need to ensure that everyone has a fairly decent understanding. We are looking forward to seeing you in class, and have a great day.